Hello there, Reject Nation. I'm Greg Alba.
I'm John Humphrey.
We're going to talk about movie franchises. The cornerstone of all great cinema lays here. Top award tier video request comes from a man named Michael B. Omni Media. You should go check out his channel, people. He said, when should a franchise stop being a franchise? Or why are current franchises struggling to develop new characters without killing or removing their legacy characters? Is it hard to have he knows how to make a good title for a good thumbnail, and when you upload, it's all in the title. Is it that hard to have the legacy characters around and develop a character that can step out of their shadow and stand on their own without it being at the expense of the people that came before? Well, John, what are your thoughts on this?
Oh, man. It's a big issue. I mean, at first I feel like when it comes to stopping franchises, that's a great question, and I feel like Terminator is slowly showing us the answer to that. It's when I think you've struggled to start, momentum again, and it just keeps kind of failing, or you keep getting met with the same response. It's like the last 3 Terminator films have been met with the same sort of lackluster response. The newest one is getting decreasing returns, and they keep making similar promises about going back to the glory days of things. So I don't know. I feel like they should let a franchise go if they're not willing to adjust it any, and we've done it so many times that there's nothing fresh about it. Like, I guess that's kind of a vague thing to say, but
I think you should stop making franchises when they're not making as much money. It's really a business. Sure, there's artistry inside of filmmaking, but at the end of the day, it's about making money. So if they're not making money anymore, can it? Plain and simple. Just stop right there. Because that's really the only thing you can do at that point, right? If it's going to keep making money, keep making them, because clearly numbers are the thing that speak louder than anything else. More than a Rotten Tomatoes score, more than a cinema score. It's about the box office return, because then we know if people are willing to pay to go keep watching. That's what keeps movies alive. Money. On a serious note, only end it when it stops making money. This podcast is complete. Podcast is done.
Yep.
Or I guess I would say when you're not when filmmakers feel like, okay, there's 2 obvious answers, I think. One obvious answer is when the franchise clearly wanted to end, that's when you should end it. It's plain and simple. When whoever helmed this original idea or gave birth to an adaptation, then it's like The Dark Knight, right? Like, clearly Christopher Nolan wanted to end it, so let it end. And sure, they have. Pirates of the Caribbean. You see, the thing with, there are certain movies that you have to factor in the world of it all, because some worlds can lend itself to franchise expansion or different world exploration, something like that. I think the problem a lot of franchises often run into is they want to just repeat the same beats from the prior movies, and they think by rehashing familiarity that is sufficient enough, when I think a lot of the time what makes something exciting is when you actually commit to taking it in a new direction, not kill off the characters from old and then replace them with new hot faces that are slightly different.
And are mostly doing the same things.
Yeah, like, I think this soft reboot thing is dull now. It's very boring to me. It's like, they're not anything different. It's just like they slightly tweak it enough so that you don't call it a remake. And that's pretty much what it is. It's like the Terminator world. I think if we're talking about, every franchise is unique to its own, but it's like when Ridley Scott came back with Prometheus, people were excited about that, and we wanted to see a different world, and it was different than the Alien films. It's just the film in and of itself wasn't all that great, and that's where the problem was. And then when they did Alien Covenant, it was like, all right, we're just gonna do Alien now and not commit to this. But I think that's why the MCU is so damn good, is because they keep enough of the same ingredients, but they know how to really genre splice or take a really different approach. And I think even Nolan did that with the Dark Knight films. He had his Batman Begins movie, and then he did the Dark Knight, which was really inspired by crime thrillers like Heat. And he's been on the record pretty much saying that's what he took inspiration from, is genre splicing it to make it a little bit different and not just how do we repeat the beats from the last movie per se, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's probably the thing. If you're not willing to do that, you got this thing where you have producers and then you have the creatives, and you never really know who is saying what and who came up with what. It's like, I was excited with James Cameron producing, and it seemed like Tim Miller with Terminator wanted to honor the first two, but then he ended up just taking from the first two and then adding some different spins on it. I don't really know. That's why I like The Last Jedi, if I'm being totally honest. It's like The Force Awakens was a good soft reboot with new faces that reminded us of the old, and then we're killing off some old characters. And then The Last Jedi, I thought, at least did different things and took it in directions that were not expected. And I feel like most franchises aren't brave enough to attempt that. I'm curious what Wonder Woman's going to do, because Wonder Woman is a very specific film that took place in a very specific decade, and then there was Wonder Woman 1984, which by its title alone and then the few glimpses we've gotten has to be an entirely different kind of movie, right? And I think that's the way you keep franchises alive, is not by just trying to explain more of the origin, but when you really do feel like you can take it in different directions. Like the Purge franchise is something that really bums me out. It's like, how come the only thing people do is kill people on the day where you can commit crime? Like, I'd love to see like a heist movie in the Purge franchise. You know, I'd like to see some weird comedy in the Purge world where some guy like accidentally dicks someone over, and then he's like, oh my god, he's gonna come after me on Purge Day. Yeah. I gotta stay away from them, you know, some like weird cat and mouse game. I think you could do like totally different weird things, but there's movies like a lot of times these franchises, the thing that they have that they go wrong with is they have a world, but then they don't do anything different within the containment of their story. And I think killing off legacy characters is not the solution. It can be. It's just do it. I think the best kind of, like Dread, I think is a great example of the kind of movies you can do. Even though it didn't do well box office wise, it's a big world that tells a self-contained story. And that's kind of what if I know we keep talking to Terminator, but the questions stem from Terminator. I think that's what makes Terminator 1 and 2 so cool, is it's a big world that tells a self-contained story. And I think a lot of times these franchises don't know how to tell fresh self-contained stories. And that's where you got to go with telling your newer movies, I think, with all these franchises.
Well, yeah, and I feel like a lot of the recent ones and these attempts at rebooting have borrowed a lot of the iconography and images from their source material, but they neglect the themes. Because that's not sexy. But I feel like if you look at the recent Terminator, or even other ones that have been better, like Dr. Sleep and stuff like that, it seems like the level of filmmaking, whoever's funding these things want them to exist on, is a different type of film than the original, source material was. So, I mean, if we're talking about like a slasher franchise, yeah, it's kind of the same thing throughout, with some deviations here or there. But, you come out of, it's like you have Terminator and Terminator 2, which are two different movies. You have Alien and Aliens, which are two different movies. And then after that, we kind of just take all the cool action and the cool imagery and try and remix those in fun and interesting ways. And they often fall short of fun and interesting because they don't bother to draw from the thoughtfulness of those films or the tension of those films. It seems like they want to, especially with the new Terminator, it seemed like they wanted to deliver us an action roller coaster that had nothing on its mind in terms of character relationships. And it's like, if you think back to Terminator 2, yeah, the action is there, it's cool, it's sci-fi, it's awesome, but we all love like the thumbs up and like the relationship between Arnold and John Connor, or Sarah Connor, and all, like there's so much character. Yeah, and I feel like you watch these more recent reboots, and even Dr. Sleep did this, where I felt like it wanted to exist on an remake level, and the Kubrick film, which it's clearly going out of its way to acknowledge, is not at all that kind of movie, and it has a totally different pace and a different sensibility. And I don't think that it's bad to break away from that, but I feel like if we're going to keep these franchises going, you have to tap into the sensibility that made them what they are. And also with these legacy characters, it's hard because you have to really commit. I feel like it's really a bummer that we seem to think 3 films at a time now instead of 1, because I think that also slights your new characters. Like the most underperforming, like the most underdeveloped character in Terminator Dark Fate is the new character who's supposed to take on the Resistance. It's the most afterthought, underwritten character in that movie. And so I don't know. I mean, you have yourself into a corner because you have the legacy, you have these people who we've had time to attach to associate with these roles, to fall in love with those performances, and you cannot duplicate those things. And so it comes down to these lightning in a bottle scenarios where you have to cast somebody terrific and you have to have a role that is pretty meaty for them to sink into. Otherwise, it's just going to feel like an exercise in keeping the money flow going.
Well, you have 2 kinds of franchises usually. You have like I think you got like a Die Hard, which is what makes that work is the character. It's not really the world of Die Hard.
It's not the plot.
It's not, like, oh, what is this crazy fictional world that John McClane lives in, and we could branch out and make a cinema. Like they're basically the worlds where it's the character, and then there are the worlds where it's the big appeal of it is the world around the character. Yeah. And so like Indiana Jones cannot exist without Indiana Jones. Die Hard cannot exist without John McClane. And when they get too old, you can the franchise. Like Blade Runner, I could see how they can pick that up and can continue, because Blade Runner is this massive sci-fi world that you can continue it without Harrison Ford needing to be in it. And so that's one thing that you have you got to factor in with a lot of these movies. It's the same. It's like we're talking about continuation or remakes. It's like, I know you often reference the Point Break remake as your go-to for what makes the Point Break original work is Patrick Swayze and Keanu Reeves in those roles. And a lot of those franchises are married to that. You can't remake Die Hard with someone else. You can't continue Die Hard with someone else. Fact of the matter is, Bruce Willis just doesn't care anymore. So,
and if you want to, you can call it Olympus Has Fallen. And have somebody else be in it and have a similar movie, but not the same movie.
It's really the best way to do it. But if we look at a lot of the longest lasting, I think Fast and Furious is interesting because I feel like it's close to running out of steam. I feel like it's close to running out of fuel.
Gas?
I feel like... What does that mean? It makes sense.
My breakdown on the.
There you go. That makes sense.
Information superhighway.
Gas. What are you? Stop making fart jokes, dude. Okay, so, like Fast and Furious was a very specific kind of franchise 4 movies in, and then they completely took it a different direction by the 5th one, and then they really honed in on that, and then they breathed new life into the franchise. Bumblebee is probably the best example I could give of a bigger world with a self-contained story. Oftentimes that's the best solution, is just tell a new self-contained story, really.
And I feel like a lot of these franchises allow you the means to do that, and people just don't necessarily take. It's like Star Wars is another excellent example where I feel like perhaps one might argue with the reception of the prequels and then the kind of waveriness of the new installments, maybe we kept the Skywalker thing going a bit too long.
Yeah.
And there's so many. It's like we're watching The Mandalorian now, and there are tons of other Star Wars shows that prove like, we don't need these core people to make this interesting. It's there's endless possibility.
Well, that's a show. I mean, because Star Wars is, like I was talking about, that's a world franchise. or universe franchise, and not a just about Luke Skywalker. You got something interesting. Like John Wick is something I think I can see how you can do a Continental show. I can see how you can do that because they've built a world around John Wick. If it was just it's like, I don't think you can do Olympus Has Fallen. I don't think you can make a world within the Olympus Has Fallen universe.
No, it's just a situation.
Like, they're both badass dudes with guns who can kick a lot of ass, but you can't do that. But with John Wick, you can. So let's go back to this question for a second. When should a franchise stop being a franchise? I think it's when I don't think it's possible to run. I think you can. People milk stuff all the time, and if you're not willing to, if you can't come up with ways to tell this story in a completely new or different way, then don't do it. Like unless, but sometimes there's wiggle room for that. Sometimes just repeating that works. Like the Rocky franchise thrives really well off of doing the same kind of thing over and over again.
Yeah. Well, it'll always come down to, like, you can make anything good if you put enough time, effort, and care into it. And so, yeah, I mean, there are franchises that have. I mean, one of my favorites, and this is kind of a weird example to pull here because it's not like a blockbuster franchise, but like the Before trilogy is all the same thing. It's just two people talking a bunch. But each time, you check in, or Evil Dead. It's like Evil Dead checks in at different points in Ash's life, and he uses that to its advantage, even though a lot of the elements and a lot of the hijinks are based on the same things.
But that's what I mean, is Evil Dead's willing to evolve its franchise. Like, if you watch the first... I think if you start watching Ash versus Evil Dead, and then you go and like, you know what, I want to know more about this. I'm going to go watch the original. You're going to be like,
what is this?
Not at all what I wanted. This is so serious and slow. Like, I think it would communicate that way to someone who is coming off of the more recent iterations of Evil Dead. But that franchise has greatly evolved into something that was just full-blown weird, demented, twisted horror into full-on horror comedy, and they've managed to make that work. And Transformers went from big giant spectacle, weird, you know what it is, and then into this like sweet 80s heartfelt movie about a girl and her Transformer, but if you just want to keep repeating, and that's what I mean by Fast and Furious, it's like, okay, you guys need to do something different now. You need to do something new, because I'm now, what was exciting and fun and the best escapism is now tiresome. There's tiresome.
There's a reason we're so excited about this new Saw movie, is because, like the first 7 Saw movies are all kind of delivering on the same idea, same world, same continuing story. And now you have this prospect of somebody else is coming in with a totally new take on this. And that at least breeds excitement because it's the unknown. And I feel like a lot of franchises sell you the promise of the known. We love Easter eggs and we love nods and things like that. And I don't think that is in and of itself bad, but I've started to feel like lately, it is kind of these delivery systems and ways to keep rights and stuff. And I don't know. You got to embrace the creativity, because you wouldn't have these originals without the risk. I feel like that's the problem, is the risk aversion makes it so that they have this thing they know is successful. So you want to keep it going, but you don't want to change it because that might be unsuccessful. And so I feel like it's a really weird place to come from now, because the only way we got all these things we're still aping is by taking chances on them.
Well, it's weird because this whole question, like especially with the latter part, is about, is it hard to have the legacy characters around and develop a character that can step out of their shadow and stand on their own? Literally, the franchise that comes to mind that has done it the best is Creed. Like, Creed 1 had Rocky, your legacy character, as the supporting character, who really shined, got an Oscar nomination, and then has successfully handed off this franchise to a new player. And, like, Rocky's barely in Creed 2. He's supposedly not going to be at all in Creed 3. And I'm okay with that. Yeah. Which is kind of weird. I'm like, I've gotten to the point where I'm okay without Rocky being in this now.
You've got a 2-film handoff.
Yeah.
And I'm sure he'll be at least alluded to.
I mean, I think it would have worked just as well if at the first 5 minutes of Creed, they just took a shotgun to Rocky in a restaurant.
Yeah. And that's why he's fighting this time, is to avenge Rocky's death.
Yeah, exactly.
Even though he's not fighting the guy who shot him. But
just as well.
Yeah. Well, and hey, in 10 more years, we can watch Michael B. Jordan hand the franchise off to somebody else and see if that works.
Yeah, his kid.
Well, I think there's also something like there are different kinds of movies, because like Creed is also, we haven't had, like when Creed came out, we hadn't had like a Rocky in at least a few years. Like we'd had Rocky Balboa a number of years before, but that's a genre where it's like every time one of those comes around, I feel like it's kind of on its own, because we don't get a huge amount of like boxing movies or racing movies with like Ford v Ferrari out now, which is not a franchise. But, I feel like Terminator or even a Dr. Sleep is the kind of movie that has a lot of similar movies around it.
Well, I'm telling you, I keep going back to the same point. Everyone says the best Terminator since Terminator 2 is the Sarah Connor Chronicles. Mm-hmm. I have not seen the Sarah Connor Chronicles, but I can imagine that for the fact that it was a network show and not this overblown movie, that it's probably a really good self-contained story.
Because they probably had to do character stuff to make up for all that time they can't do action
Exactly.
stuff.
And I think that's why Creed was successfully worked, because you really got to know the characters. I think the problem with a lot of these bigger franchises, especially the ones that really revolve around the world, you couldn't do Rocky 7 and and then have Creed be the main character. You had to have called it Creed. And I think with films like Star Wars, or Terminator, or whatever, the thing that they get bogged down by is they want to explain more origin, they want to explain more of the world, but they don't put enough time into really getting you to latch on to the new characters, because they're trying to get to the action, they're trying to get to the more world building, they're trying to do all these things instead of going, well, the main thing we just got to care about is the characters, right? Like it's like rule number one in storytelling. It's the most basic rule, which is make you really invested in the characters' journeys and less about plot and twists and surprises. It's none of that really matters in a cliche movie if you love the characters. Really, it's that simple. And I think that's like what most of these franchises get bogged down by is style, world building, origin explanation. And when I'm like, we don't need less expansion on that and more telling on the emotional stakes of these characters, and that's all you really need. That's really all you need to keep the franchise fresh.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of times I get the sense that whoever's making these movies kind of forgets that we care because this is a popular franchise. Clearly there's interest, but I think they forget to make us care about the characters every time. I think they just assume like, oh, you know who these people are, roughly what the world is, so you're already invested. And that's not necessarily true. You need to reinvest us every movie, and as long as you're going to keep things going like that. I saw something earlier this year that made me think, and it's not a franchise, but like that movie Crawl could have easily been completely forgettable. And it's really straightforward. It's just a, horror thriller set in one environment. But what makes that movie work is that the characters are written enough and the actors are invested enough in them that it elevates the entire experience. And I feel like if that little movie could do that, a lot of these big franchise movies kind of have no excuse, because it shouldn't be that hard to give us a few character bits that are actually lived in and not just here's a glance at my family photo or something like that. Like I feel like there's a lot of one line or one moment, save the cat style character development, and it's like, we care, moving on, and it doesn't really work.
Well, sometimes you gotta let the name go. Like you gotta let Skywalker go. You gotta let the Bourne name go. Honestly, Bourne Legacy is a fine movie. And it could have worked, and it could have been its own trilogy or whatever, if they just didn't have anything to do with Jason Bourne. Real, like its little acknowledgments of Bourne is fine, but calling it the Bourne Legacy without Bourne in there is a big reason why that movie specifically doesn't work, because you put a very specific expectation on an audience member. Most of your audience at that point. You want to see Jason Bourne show up. You want the same kind of movie. You essentially want a Bourne Part 4 at that point, when that wasn't what it wanted to do. It wanted to do its own thing. and then it got bogged down by that.
The Bourne Legacy makes it sound like Matt Damon's going to hand it off to Jeremy Renner in the movie.
Yeah.
Like, not just be like, you're another agent from the same program. And then his legacy is affecting you. You know?
Yeah. And I think that also, like, that's part of what kind of I'm not overly concerned because they've been so consistent since part 3. Is Mission Impossible. But a big part of what's made Mission Impossible so fresh is they kept changing directors. Now, the last 2 have been the same director, and as much as I loved Fallout, I also was there going, in a lot of ways, this is like the greatest hits of the last few installments. And they do it really well. They execute it very well. And there is a lot of tension, and a big part of what makes those films work so well, of course, is Tom Cruise really being in camera, doing all these crazy stunts. But the fact that he's doing 2 more movies back to back with the same director, I'm not 100% sold on it, because Fallout was the first time they ever had a director come back for the following installment. And I was like, this is great. It is, but there's a lot of the greatest hits.
It's not as fresh as the previous.
Yeah. I love it, but I still preferred Rogue Nation over it. It's like the action, I think, is better in Fallout. But you know what I mean. So yeah, I think Mission Impossible is less. It's like Mission Impossible, you can hand that off to someone if they're willing to do what Tom Cruise is willing to do.
Yeah, you got to find another daredevil who's going to put their life on the line for these.
Because there's totally a world there, absolutely, that you could toy with.
And he inherited the franchise from a totally other cast.
Yeah. But you need an actor who's willing to do all the things that Tom Cruise was willing to do too, and that is not easy to find.
Josh Gad,
people, yeah,
definitely.
So yeah.
You know, just
we answer the question in this 30 minutes?
I think we have. Right?
When you're out of ideas.
When you're out of ideas and you're not writing your script, you're just kind of focus grouping it, maybe you should take a break.
All right, guys. Well, when should a franchise end? Comment below. You can subscribe to The Real Rejects. Click that notification bell. And, hey, check us out on Patreon. Michael B., thank you, dude, so much. I hope you have a happy Thanksgiving. If I were you, I know you've been with your girlfriend for a while. What would be a lot of fun is you can pressure her into this, saying, like, if you want to show how grateful you are that I am your boyfriend, here's what you can do. You can commit the act of gluttony like Kevin Spacey in Seven and just fatten her up. Just shove down a whole bunch of food and then cook her in the oven and then eat her afterwards.
That's true love. That's a way to keep someone with you forever.
That is until you digest them.
Oh, yeah.
But for the most part, they are a part of you.
You'll take some nutrients and some protein. You know, some things like that. Some bone marrow is good for you.
Eat your girlfriend this holiday season. Gobble, gobble. Take care.